colonization, and this unit on colonization is going to occur before the colonization of Jamestown. So today we're going to start off by talking about colonies that were founded in the lower 48 states that occurred before Jamestown came along. And while many people think of colonization and they think of Great Britain, and of course in school we're taught more of the British form of American history or colonial history, that would make sense that we would think about Jamestown, we would think about Plymouth. But at the very beginning of the colonization movement, it was actually France who jumped into the game. And before we jump into that, I wanted to essentially bridge some history from the last time we talked about France, and that was in the Verrazano episode, which you could go back in our 16th Century Explorers unit and watch. But between Verrazano and today's episode, a few things happened in France that I think listeners should be aware of. First, Francis I, who was the monarch that commissioned Verrazano to go explore the eastern seaboard of the United States, he died in 1547, and his son, Henry II, became king and served for 12 years before dying in 1559. During Henry II's reign, the Protestant Reformation began to become very popular in France, and it led to the establishment of the French Huguenots, who were French Lutherans and Protestants that lived in France. Upon Henry's death, his son Francis II became king, and Francis's health at the time was very poor, and he was unable essentially to do significant governance because of his poor health. He was also a very young man at the time. So Francis II takes over as King of France in 1559. Now, meanwhile, over in Spain, the country's finances were being strained. And this is likely because the law of diminishing returns was beginning to set in for Spain's growth into the New World. And as this was going on, Charles V, who, as you'll recall, was someone we followed early on. In fact, we followed him all the way back at episode 7 when we talked about Bartolomé de las Casas. He was still the King of Spain into the 1550s, but he slowly began to abdicate, and before his death, he actually abdicated the Holy Roman Emperor status to his brother Ferdinand, and the crown of Spain to his son Philip in 1556. Now, Charles's health was in decline, and in 1558 he died, but Philip II, his son, was crowned king and served as king for a lengthy time in Spain. So in the late 1550s, the Spanish unsuccessfully tried to colonize an area of Florida where modern-day Pensacola is located. The man behind the attempt was named Tristan de Luna, and he actually served on the Coronado expedition, which you'll recall us covering a few weeks ago. The Pensacola colony was destroyed by a hurricane within weeks of being established in 1559. Multiple attempts were made by the Spanish to sustain the colony, but it was ultimately abandoned in 1561. And unfortunately, I couldn't find any writings on the Pensacola colony, otherwise we would be talking about it today. But let's go back to France now. And in late 1560, Francis II, less than a year and a half into his rule, still very ill, he was a just very sickly individual, now has to deal with the religious tensions between the Catholics in France and the French Huguenots. And these tensions begin to slowly boil up. Even though you read a history book, and in a history book it says, suddenly a war breaks out, rarely does that occur just kind of out of combustion. There are a lot of things that begin to happen prior to that. And in this case, it was just tension between these two groups. Before 1560 would end, Francis II died, and his brother Charles IX would become king, and Charles IX at the time was only 10 years old. So now you have a child serving as King of France while religious tensions boil, and these religious tensions boiled over on March 1st, 1562, when the Huguenots were massacred at a place called Vassy. And this sparked the French Wars of Religion. And essentially this was a civil war between the Protestants and the Catholics in France. And despite this animosity, what's interesting is that Charles IX had a cordial relationship with many high-level Huguenots within the French government. One of those being the Admiral of France, a man by the name of Gaspard de Coligny. Coligny, seeing the events that are occurring in France, the fighting and the possibility of outright civil war, and not only that, there's a chance the Huguenots could lose and be expelled from France. Coligny wanted to establish safe havens in the New World for the Huguenots to go to in the event that they were either expelled or if the persecution became so great that they needed somewhere else to go. Now, Coligny did not look at the area known as the United States first. In fact, in 1555, before Charles even became king, Coligny helped facilitate the start of the first Huguenot colony in Rio de Janeiro. And Coligny was not alone in this venture. He asked Jean Ribault to lead an expedition to establish a colony in Florida. And this was a few years after Rio de Janeiro. Ribault was joined by a man named René Laudonnière. And you have to understand at the time that Florida was not considered what we know as the state of Florida, although that was the popular area for the Spanish. It was considered that area plus any land that touched it. So essentially, the whole northern part of North America. So Ribault sailed and ended up in modern-day South Carolina, where he established a fort named Charles Fort, which is named after Charles IX, and he left behind 27 men to watch the fort. Now, if you're wanting to know where Charles Fort was located, you may recognize the name of the island today as Parris Island. So Parris Island, and for those of you listening who have been to Parris Island, may not have known that at one time this represented a French colony that existed nearly 5 decades before Jamestown. Ribault decided to head back to France to get supplies and return to Charles Fort, but when he got back to France, the War of Religions had broken out, and it was a really bad situation. So Ribault could not leave the Huguenots empty-handed there. They needed him in France, so he assisted the Huguenots in France during the War of Religions, and ultimately he is expelled to England in defeat. In England, Ribault was able to gain favor and an audience with Queen Elizabeth I, who was also a Protestant monarch. But he was soon arrested and imprisoned and was accused of being a spy. You have to keep in mind that French and British relations at this time were not good. They weren't good for a long period of time. And so even though they may have had the same Protestant base in terms of religion, Elizabeth and the British were still concerned that Ribault may have some nefarious reasons for being in England. Now, for today's episode, we do cover a little bit of Ribault's writings, which were written while he was in prison in England, along with the writings of Laudonnière. I don't have any direct quotes for you today because of how the writings were laid out. However, the episode is structured around what they recalled and what their experiences were. In Ribault's writings, he mentions the previous expeditions of Sebastian Cabot and John de Verrazano. So at this time, those expeditions were considered rather popular still among many European travelers. With Ribault not returning to Charlesfort, the colony struggled. Remember, there were only 27 men left behind, and they fell into mutiny, with the commander of the colony being killed. The remaining colonists at Charlesfort built their own boat and set sail for France, leaving one man behind. How would you like to be that guy, the only man at Charlesfort? The colonists had to resort to cannibalism in this ship on the way back to France and ended up being rescued by the British in their waters. So certainly a bad situation there for the colonists at Charlesfort. And remember, there's one man left behind there. In 1563, the War of Religions takes a break when a peace is signed between the Huguenots and the French Catholics. Admiral Coligny was able at this time to send another expedition to America. With Ribault still jailed in England, Coligny appointed René Laudonnière to lead the voyage, and that's how Laudonnière enters our episode today. Just before Laudonnière left for Charlesfort, word arrived regarding the fate of the colony. So those men that had been rescued out in British waters, the word got back as to what occurred. So Laudonnière left in April of 1564 to settle a new colony. The plan was for Ribault to follow some months later with supplies, given that he is released from custody in England. In June, Laudonnière arrives at modern-day Jacksonville, and he founds Fort Caroline. A couple of weeks after founding Fort Caroline, Laudonnière sent some men to retrieve the sole occupant of Charlesfort. During this time, Laudonnière befriended some of the local tribes there in northeastern Florida, which helped keep the inhabitants of Fort Caroline safe. We've learned from the Spanish episodes in that area of Florida that keeping a bad relationship with natives is going to make colonization nearly impossible. So with those relationships secured, on July 28th, the ships are sent back to France as the colonists await new supplies from Ribault. By the end of August, Ribault hadn't come, supplies were running low, and tempers began to run high. Meanwhile, Ribault got caught in another wave of violence in France after he got released from prison in England and was not able to leave for Florida in the time that he wanted to. As the fall set in, the colonists became increasingly dependent upon the natives for food. In November, a small group of men decided to leave the colony, so now the French are beginning to split up. On December 8th, those group of men that split off built and completed a ship with armaments and left. And it is alleged that they didn't sail back to France, but they sailed down to the Caribbean and became pirates. And again, if you're going somewhere for the promises of getting rich and you're disappointed by what you've experienced so far, which these men certainly had at Charles Fort and at Fort Caroline, becoming a pirate may be the next attractive thing for some of these people, and that appears to be what happened. Even with the misfits, if you will, gone, Laudonnière over the winter had to fight off a mutiny, and the colonists continued to struggle, living mostly off of roots and what little the natives could provide. It is now 1565, and if you'll recall, Cabeza de Vaca had a period of time in a different part of the country, Texas, where he had to live off of roots in order to survive. That summer, 1565, Ribault was finally able to leave France and head for Fort Caroline. He did so with 5 ships and 800 settlers. And to give you a comparison, the original Jamestown colony had slightly over 100 settlers. So this is a big group. Meanwhile, Laudonnière and his men were getting so desperate for food that they kidnapped a native chief named Utina and were holding him hostage, demanding food from his tribe. So those good relations with the local natives clearly have come apart. During this time, rival natives rival to Utina, come to Laudonnière and ask him to kill Utina or turn him over to them. This piece of information I find interesting because it's not that you have this situation now where other tribes are coming in because they see a possibility of their interests being served. But clearly it goes back to the communication between these tribes that we've talked about in the last unit. Somehow these individuals found out about this, and obviously by finding out, they wanted Utina killed or turned over to him. In June of 1565, a maize harvest occurred that allowed the natives to share their food with the colonists. But the colonists became very sick because they overate. And it's one of those things in medical science, it's an actual thing where if you're starving and you overeat, you can become very sick. Shortly thereafter, in July of 1565, the colonists repelled an attack by some 300 natives, but not before 2 members of the colony were killed and 22 were wounded. On July 20th, a ship shows up to the colony, and people are a little bit cautious. Laudonnière fears that this may be a Spanish ship because the Spanish have control over that area. The ship turned out to belong to a one M. John Hawkins, and John Hawkins was a British man who had just completed transporting slaves from Africa to Hispaniola. Hawkins had anchored in the area looking for fresh water, so he wasn't looking for a colony or any other people. He was just looking for fresh water. And Hawkins' trip transporting slaves, and Hawkins also kept a journal where he wrote some stuff down about these trips, becomes one of the first known writings in American history that involves the transportation of African slaves. Hawkins' arrival piques the interest of the local natives, who start coming in from all over and offering gifts to him. And this, I'm sure, creates a little discomfort for the French, being kind of in the middle. Hawkins in his writing mentions that the group who left Fort Caroline to participate in piracy ended up being caught by the Spanish, imprisoned, and most ultimately were hanged. Hawkins, seeing that Laudonnière and his men wanted to go back to France, offered to take them. Laudonnière refused because he did not know what the relations were between England and France at the time. Valid concern. Laudonnière's men again threatened mutiny, so they clearly disagreed with this decision, and Hawkins decides, as sort of an in-between here, to offer to leave a small ship that could transport some men back. Laudonnière agrees after consulting with his men, which I'm sure calmed them down, and pays for the ship. Hawkins then leaves, and Laudonnière's men prepare for a voyage home by baking biscuits and gathering water. Biscuits at this time were considered sort of the long-term food currency that you would use, the canned goods, if you will, of the 16th century. On August 28th, they're preparing to leave when suddenly Ribault arrives. So he's finally at Fort Caroline. Ribault relieves Laudonnière of his duty and offers to make him a co-regency. You know, Laudonnière's been through a lot there at Fort Caroline, and so I think Ribault was trying to not necessarily show him some mercy, but help him out. Laudonnière declined and felt that it was better for him to return to France. Before Laudonnière could leave, however, a Spanish fleet showed up under the leadership of Pedro Menendez. And Pedro Menendez was a Spanish explorer. He was sent by King Philip II, remember him, he's the son of Charles V, to repel the French and destroy the colony. So Menendez got word of the French being there, and he shows up ready to destroy the colony. A brief battle between the ships occurs, but weather conditions ended up causing this battle to not really be ideal, so the Spanish retreated to the south. Ribault left Laudonnière and 100 men at the fort and proceeded south, sailing south in pursuit of the Spanish. The Spanish end up setting up a fort just south of Fort Caroline. Unfortunately for Ribault, a hurricane came and sank his entire fleet of ships. It also pushed them further south than their original target, and they were washed ashore, forced to walk north to get back to Fort Caroline. The Spanish, on their own marching north from their fort, easily overtook Fort Caroline and put the men there to death. To the King of Spain, Fort Caroline represented the home of the pirates, who you'll recall left earlier, and Protestantism, which were both considered evil and heresy. Laudonnière was able to escape the fort with 40 men and sailed back to France in 3 ships that Ribault had left over. Menendez's forces end up going south, tracking down Ribault's men, and including Ribault, put them all to death. So it was a sad end to both Charles Fort and Fort Caroline. Gaspard Coligny, who we talked about earlier, was in France, and he was reassigned in 1566 and ultimately murdered in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. The Spanish would end up building their own fort at Fort Caroline, but abandon it a few years later after a French revenge attack. Laudonnière returned safely to France, faded from responsibility, and died in 1574. While the French were not successful in colonizing Florida, their presence would directly lead to the oldest continually inhabited European settlement in the continental United States. And not only are we going to talk about that next week, but we're going to turn around and look at Menendez's version of these events, the attack on Fort Caroline and the attack on Ribault. So we will talk about the other perspective next time on Historical Context.
Ah!